Today's topic is Northern Europe, 1400 to 1500. And I want to give you a region so you can visualize it as we begin the talk. Uh, it really is the area that was ruled by the Dukes of Burgundy in the late 15th century. And they were an extremely wealthy lineage of aristocrats, very eccentric, but very, very wealthy, very developed court. And you can see that the Duchy of Burgundy occupied part of what we now call Belgium, part of what we now call Holland, and it made its way south into France, into Beaune and Dijon. And of course, goes without saying that when we think of Burgundy, we think of the fine wines that came from that region in the past and which still do. So, to give you a feeling for this late Gothic world and maybe to compare it with Italy, they also had tremendous problems in the 14th century, including war, plague, and social turmoil as feudalism faded away. The Black Death came north and decimated many areas, did similar damage to what had it done in Italy. There was maybe some healing and development in the 15th century, especially the late part of the 15th century, where some powerful kings and nobility consolidated their power and trading and capitalism built an economic network. And I would say for a theme of the artwork, what was the real fixation or the central theme behind the artwork? I would have to say the balance and the connection between piety and power. The first works I'm going to show you are actually from a series. They were created by brothers called the Limbourg brothers for the Duc de Berry, a Burgundian noble. And these came from a very, very precious set of 12 illuminations that were the months of the year. And they were kind of a calendar in that sense. And each one of these elaborate images of months included the seasonal tasks and some aspect of that time of the year. And it's worth pointing out that in Northern culture, books were especially treasured art items for their portability and for the density of their imagery. So here's an image that is the New Year's celebration. And so this would be January. It includes the Duke and his Chamberlain. And I want to point out, when we discussed Italy, we talked about the fact that the church controlled lapis lazuli and reserved blue for the cloak of the Virgin. But here in the north, apparently they don't have that control. And we have the Duke wearing lapis lazuli, kind of a blue gown with gold additions. And you can see above this, we have images of astrology. We have astrological figures up above. And we even have kind of a weird northern Apollo with his chariot, not a classical Apollo, but a man with a cart being pulled by horses that has the golden sun with its rays at his forehead. But this is obviously a propaganda image. It's very carefully chosen because it shows the generosity of the Duke. And that may not have been the case, in fact, but everyone is about to file by and enjoy this fantastic feast. And in the background, you see the very, very crowded banners and flags of some of the Burgundian private armies crowded into the scene. I think perhaps this image tells us a little bit more because you can see the great kind of barrier. You can see the wall of the castle with its blue turrets. And then in front of that, we have the life of the peasants as they plow and sow. And I wish I had a detail, but maybe you can focus in on the peasant who is holding seeds in his apron. And as he distributes them, there are magpies following him along that are eating the seeds. And that is a frustrating detail of that life. This is an image that is really not talked about very much, maybe because it's partly destroyed, but the work of a real genius of early Northern art, Klaus Sluter. And this was a group of carvings that was called the Well of Moses, a massive, massive baptismal font. And when you look at it, there's a few things you should be able to notice. One is there are just a few very, very pale hints of color on the carvings. And you can imagine that this was fully painted, life size or lifelike colors originally. There's a little bit of blue, a little bit of ochre still on it. Also, if you take a look at Moses with his kind of intense expression and his beard parted down the middle, you may notice that he has horns. And it's not uncommon, both in the north and even in Italy, to see Moses with horns. And that came because there was a mistranslation in the Greek Bible that described, it actually described Moses having kind of an aura or a certain intense appearance, but it got mistranslated as horns. So you see them for a while in the carvings. This originally had a massive crucifix. I think the crucifix was maybe either 12 or 15 feet tall, with a carved Christ also by Sluter, and it was broken and shattered during the French Revolution. So here's a recreation of I think the very austere, and lovely Christ that you would have found at the top of this well of Moses. One point I want to make, there was highly developed naturalism in this sculpture, and it's from the late 14th century. Around the same time, here is a set of panels that was made for an altarpiece in a chapel in Dijon, France, right at the end of the 14th century. And mainly, I want you to take a look at these and see how the artist crammed quite a bit of narrative. On the left, we have an annunciation, meaning it's being announced to Mary by the angel that she will be the mother of the Christ child. And you can see he's reading what looks like a ticker tape in his hands, kind of scrolling through this little document to speak with her. And an Easter lily blooms in a tiny pot between the two. You can also see we have continuous narrative because Mary appears twice. She is outside the scene, outside this tiny chapel, consulting with a man that I assume is Joseph a little bit later. But take a look and just take in the scene with your eye for detail. First of all, it's interesting to see things so cut away because the tiny chapel where Mary is reading looks phone booth sized, but with the filigreed arches of Gothic architecture, you see the details of the floors in imperfect perspective. You see a pink tower behind it, and you have what I can only call soft serve ice cream hills that frame all of this. So there's an unreality, there's an intensity, and there's a love of detail in these scenes. They really are designed to tell stories more than anything else. So why was Northern art different from the art of Italy? I want to give you just a few guesses about that and a few thoughts about it. Colder climate in many of these areas, and near the coast, up in what later became Amsterdam or Bruges, lots of moisture. So fresco did not appear. You didn't see the large plaster spaces where frescoes appeared as they did in warmer Italy. And I think in the colder climate, you had artists either working in books on illuminations, or when something close to what we call easel painting came along, artists would work on panels, on wood panels in smaller spaces. So along with that, we get the development of oil pigments. And I want to point out that the first paintings that you and I would call oil paintings really had two different media. They generally would start out with tempera painting or egg yolk painting, and they were done in grisaille. And grisaille is a French word that means black and white or monochrome. So working in very, very slow fashion with tiny squirrel hair brushes and egg yolks. I think most painters at this era had, a chicken coop. We were saying the same as in Italy. They would create the complete image in grisaille, in tempera on a small oak panel, and then the oil pigments went on last to add the color. And that's what we now call glazing, when you get transparent layers of oil paint. And that technology, developed very, very rapidly, and it gave new possibilities because it meant that both sharp detail and greater softness could be developed for these paintings on panel. And as a result, By the early 15th century, you get fabulous masterpieces like this one, which you could see if you're in New York in the cloisters at the Metropolitan Museum. This three-panel altarpiece by a man that I would say we 80% for sure know that he was a man named Robert Campin. But for a long time, he was called the Master Flamel because it's an unsigned work and hard to attribute. But it's similar to some other works by this individual. Looking at the three panels, you can see on the left the patrons who paid for the painting to demonstrate their piety, of course, get front row seats to this miracle of the Annunciation. And true to form, the man gets the best view, he's in front, and the woman behind him, gets whatever view she can get over his shoulder. They have entered through a gate where you can, in the background, if you were seeing the original painting, tiny, tiny details of the city of Bruges through that gateway. And then in the center panel, the Annunciation, and I'm going to give you a larger view of that in a moment. And on the right, Joseph working on a mousetrap. So going in a little bit closer, this really gives you the feeling of Northern art because it's tempting to call it naturalistic. It is finely detailed. It has subtlety in shading. It is very, very refined and resolved. In a certain way, it's perfect. But to look at it another way, it has what I can only call a bowling ball floor. The perspective isn't worked out yet, and things are tilted up, almost like Cezanne would do later. So we don't yet have scientific perspective, and the figures, to be fair, they are doll-like. Their poses are somewhat stiff, and their emotions are very, very restrained. So it's a very, very impressive, credible world, but it is not a world that you could entirely call alive. And symbols dominate. We have the pages on the New Testament blowing in the breeze as if to narrate the story of this moment. We have a brass cauldron or kettle hanging in the background, and that's a reference to the Immaculate Conception, the purity and the cleanliness of Mary's womb as it receives the child. A tiny detail, I don't know if my pointer arrow is working, I don't think it is, but above the golden wings of the angel, there is a tiny, tiny flying angel who holds a toothpick crucifix that is headed right for the womb of Mary on a glazed laser beam. That's the best way I can describe it. And there is so much iconography in these paintings. I don't think it's even all been identified, but I've had people tell me, for example, that the clouds, you shouldn't think of the clouds as sky. You should think of that as heaven outside the shutters. And even the stain on the fireplace could be interpreted as the presence of the Holy Spirit, which is there and yet is somehow not there at the same time. But what an intense and fantastic and fully realized world. And there is Joseph working on the mousetrap. That symbolizes Christ serving as bait to trap the devil. And there was a curator some years ago at the Metropolitan Museum who has a project, actually created the mousetrap that's depicted in that panel. And the museum staff tested it and they got a mouse with it. They found that it worked. And again, one very remarkable thing about these Northern paintings, they take the stories of the Bible and make them contemporary. So we're envisioning this whole moment of the Annunciation and Joseph making the mousetrap in a 14th century Belgian carpenter shed. And in the windows behind him is the city with architecture that we would recognize today. So the greatest, best known, most coveted work of Northern art has to be the Ghent altarpiece. And there's so much to tell you about this. I'm not going to try and run on and, side rail the rest of the lecture, but it is a work with a very, very colorful history. It's been, in one way or another, it has been stolen or moved or taken, I think, 13 times. And here you see it in this heavy metal frame in the closed position. And I've been told by some of my older students that it used to be, if you'd go to St. Bavos, if you'd go to Ghent and see this, there was an attendant that, on the 15 minutes would open it and close it and show you all the different positions. Since then, it's been moved to the interior of a museum, but that's how you would have seen it closed had you visited. And I just want to break down some of the details. You can see that it contains these wonderful individual panels that have the feeling of space with glazing. They created the feeling that you're actually looking at a kind of a niche, and it's occupied by another patron and his wife. And I would say their marriage is in trouble. I'll let you, interpret on your own, but she looks at him with quite a glare. He looks to heaven, and she looks at him. But here's an image of the complete work open, and you can see the majesty of these panels where you have Christ the King making really a kind of a regal gesture and a gesture of blessing above this entire scenario that includes an organist and armies and the Lamb of God and Adam and Eve. So just want to point out that one of the panels, this one on the far left, is still missing after this whole series of well, the whole group of paintings was taken by the Nazis, and Hitler wanted it, and Goering wanted it, and apparently they had a kind of a squabble over it, and not all of it has been found. And there's such an intense treasure hunt going on, for that last panel, that the authorities in Ghent have forbidden people from digging because people were digging all over the city trying to find where this one panel might have been buried. But when you see it in the museum, you're seeing a recreation of that panel. And that's the experience you'd have today with, modern lighting, the way you'd experience this panel. And you can see how with it being fully restored, you get the gleam and the glow of glazed oil paint and what must have been a absolutely spectacular phenomenon in the 15th century, where people hadn't seen anything this vivid and refined. So just a bit of information. I put this here to keep myself alert to the details. So it suffered 13 separate crimes in its history, the victim of theft, fire, and madmen. And so that's a way to give some statistics to this painting. It's currently being restored, apparently. Here's an image of where it was found in a mine, I think in a salt mine, by the monuments men after World War II, one of the main panels. And I want to give you a feeling for the detail. This is just one of the scenes, the panel where we're symbolizing the sacrifice of God while, as the Lamb of God, while the fountain spills the water of life. And when we come in close, that is the kind of detail you get if you saw the Lamb of God and you came in close to that image, where you could read the inscription at the top of the cross and see the tiny gilded rays emanating from the bleeding lamb. Here, some of the apostles. And when you view this, you can see the soles of their feet of the men who are kneeling. This is God, all powerful, reads the inscription, sorry. And then Mary is the Queen of Heaven. And I think this is a point where you can really begin to feel a contrast between Northern art and Italian art. And let's do it with a side by side. Look how different the conception of Christ is in Northern Europe. A regal figure like a Byzantine king, absolutely remote and heavily jeweled. And look at how Giotto had portrayed Christ as a real human body, suffering, held intimately by a crowd of people who were engaged with him with mourning angels. So a very, very, very different conception of Christ. And I'm only going to do this for a moment, but I want to give you something that in your spare time you may want to do. There is a very, very expensive and detailed website that gives incredibly complete information about this panel. So let me see if I can bring it up quickly and I'll give you a little bit of a preview. If you want to Google it, it's called Closer to Van Eyck. That's how you can search for it and find it. And among the things that you can find here, let me go to some of the extreme close-ups. So let's look, for example, at hermits and see what we get. They're fantastic. And these even allow you to zoom in further to see the craquelure, to see the pearls that hold together the brooches. Let's try one more. Let's try Singing Angels. And this is nice because the side by side with the black and white image shows you the grisaille, what it would have looked like in tempera before the glaze was added on top to give it full color. But so much information on this website, including x-rays of the panels, details about all of the thefts and degradations. It is a really, really wonderful and entertaining and informative website. So on your own time, you can go back there and take a look. One more mention. It's thought that Adam and Eve were the very last panels that were created. And I would imagine at the time they were painted, somebody probably came into the studio and said, hey, that's a little bit Italian, because nudes were beginning to appear in Italian art, especially at Adam and Eve. And so these look, very different from the king and the queen of heaven. They have maybe that vulnerability that you would have seen in Italian art. Here is a triptych from Louvain, Belgium, by Roger van der Weyden, a great northern master. And there's so much to admire about this painting, but I'm going to start with this. Take a look at the shape of the frame, and you'll notice that it is cruciform. So even the panel itself has been shaped to go with the theme of crucifixion. And the other thing that's happened, it's like the panels we saw in the Ghent altarpiece. You get a feeling looking at the flat surface of the panel that there is a gilded wall behind these figures. You get the feeling of space. And of course, that's an illusionism that's coming along with oil painting. And I had somebody ask me a few years ago, this is how I learned, people ask me and I look it up, what were those decorations in the very, very corners, the upper corners on the right and the left? Turns out this picture was paid by the Archers Guild. So if those decorations look like bows and arrows, that's how they were inspired. But there is still a hint of the Byzantine here, but rather than the flat gold foil, you have a golden space as Christ's body is lowered from the crucifix. Look at the powerful composition where the dynamic diagonal form of Christ's body is mirrored in the fainting body of his mother in blue. And in fact, her face is a little bit blue, but you almost get the feeling that the effect of his body being lowered is to cause her to take the same pose. And what an essay in color with reds, a kind of a lavender over there on the left, the deep blue reserved for Mary, fantastic fabrics, great details in hair and in the beard of the man lowering the figure and weeping into a handkerchief over on the upper left. Here's another painting by van der Weyden, which I think what I admire most about this painting is that van der Weyden decided he wanted to give you the deepest space possible, rather than setting it against a wall or in a kind of a glowing room or atmosphere. He gave us a view down a river, which to me is kind of an allegory of the passage of time. So we have two figures. It's kind of another mirror. We have a man and a woman looking through the crenellations in the architecture onto that flowing river. And then directly between Mary and St. Luke, we have these architectural features. We have the classical columns. We have a wonderful silk banner that flows behind Mary. We have the elaborate terracotta tile on the floor, and kind of a wonderful detail of Mary offering her breast to the Christ child with her fingers clasping her own breast, and a kind of delighted looking kid, although still doll-like, but you can see the figure coming to life. Look at the seriousness of St. Luke. I think St. Luke is drawing Mary, so he is a kind of a stand-in for van der Weyden. He is himself an artist. So among the images that we see created by Flemish artists, we'll call them early Belgian artists, we get the first appearance of self-portraits. We also get private devotional images that are paid for by individual wealthy patrons. And we begin to get a fusion of the secular and the symbolic, so that the church and non-religious subject matter begin to be have interactions with each other. In this early Last Supper by Dirk Bouts, made in the middle of the 15th century, we get very, very intense arrangement around this table. We can see him really working with the problems of sight and perspective. And some of the things that I want to point out to you after I point out, by the way, that Christ is too large. You notice the size of his head? I think that goes back to Gothic art, that the most important figure had to be the largest, but he has this kind of fantastic elongated head. But as we look at the arrangement, this artist has done many, many things to give it symmetry. And first of all, to give this kind of triangular composition that radiates out from the top of the doorway and, goes through the panels of the tiles on the floor. A wonderful detail of two men looking in from the serving room there on the left. And as in the other paintings I've shown you, a slice of ancient Belgium, of Belgium of the 15th century through the window. But tremendous symmetry and order in this painting. Christ makes the gesture of blessing directly in front of a pewter platter. And of course, it's rather advanced for bouts to put figures on both sides of the table. And then the figures that have their backs to us turn in three-quarter view so we can see them. Somebody on the internet has a lot of time on their hands because they recreated the architectural space of this painting. And of course, that's to make the point that it was accurate enough to really give you an architectural model, as well as, all of the figures and all of the narrative. And someone else worked out that there is the use of an equilateral triangle in making this composition. And that would place Christ right at the center of that triangle. Actually, his hand is directly at the center of the painting. So all these things, but you kind of feel it when you see the painting, when it gets laid out and diagrammed, you realize, how much planning went into the proportions and the placement on that panel. Kind of a wonderful but strange painting by Hugo van der Goes, an altarpiece that is now in Florence. But it's an example of tempera and oil paint together. And it has many, many strange variations in proportion. For example, people have said that the Christ child looks too small, laid on the ground, almost like a doll, if you will. And then the angels appear to be a kind of a different species of physical beings because they're smaller than the Magi or Joseph or Mary. But they, circle around this entire scene. In the wings, we have, a Christ figure, an adult Christ figure looking in with his halo. We have witnesses over on the right in front of a beautiful landscape. We have architecture and timbers that tell us we're in this kind of outdoor manger. So it is very, very theatrically and very beautifully staged and has both real and unreal elements. When I say real, the people are credible and have form and have weight and have been detailed with glazing, but we also have flying, floating angels with miraculous halos. A 15th century altarpiece by Memling. This one was made for a hospital, the Hospital of St. John, and it features the mystic marriage of St. Catherine, who's on the left. And the idea was that by marrying the infant Christ, who's putting a tiny ring on her figure, she was essentially taking the vow of chastity. She was becoming the wife of Christ, and that established her as a nun in this order. And we have some grim and gruesome details on the left. We have the head of Herod being presented on a platter by a man who's just performed the decapitation. And then over on the upper right, we have this kind of weird rainbow world. I believe they're called a mandorla. And it is a cross section of a kind of floating heaven where you see a praying figure, looking into that world where we have Christ enthroned, surrounded by angels and apostles. And that is all the vision of St. John. So again, that's a good example of how you have credibility and reality and absolutely crystal clear, believable imagery and architecture, but you have a mystic religious, spiritual world full of mysteries and impossibilities at the same time. Here in the famous Arnolfini wedding, we go into something that in many ways is secular. It probably is a marriage that was made for the purpose of business. So at one level, it's a business transaction, a very, very wealthy, Italian banker marrying his very, very wealthy bride. And you can see a certain hesitation and shiftiness in their eyes. The bronze chandelier above them, which is an absolute masterpiece of oil painting, has one tiny lit candle to indicate the presence of Christ. The dog is there for loyalty. Let's hope they have that in their marriage. And you notice that his shoes have been taken off, to indicate that he would be standing on holy ground. And the very, very best, and of course, their marriage bed is there. The witnesses are probably waiting outside the room, and they will come in and check for blood on the sheets after the marriage is hopefully consummated. But what I wanted to say is this is really a wedding certificate in the form of a painting. And it is the best comment I've ever gotten about this painting. Years and years ago, I had somebody say to me, that man really looks like Vladimir Putin. And I thought about that. And this is where I'm going to veer off art history for a second, but I couldn't resist a couple of years ago taking some Photoshop to that and putting Vladimir Putin in. And then it kind of just kept going and became, when a painting becomes iconic, it's kind of easy to have fun with it. But let's get back to, art history. There's a detail of that chandelier. There is a mirror with a kind of a fisheye convex view where you actually can see the artist at work in front of the couple. There are glass rosary beads hanging on the wall where light, and of course, light being a symbol of Christ, makes its way through the rosary beads. There's a broom, a hint of domesticity, even for a very, very wealthy woman. And then that incredibly fabulous overwrought signature of Jan van Eyck, which in Latin says, Jan van Eyck made this. Well, of course he did. But the signature is a new development. Here's a painting from the middle of the 15th century that shows a goldsmith, weighing gold. And you can take this both ways. You can take it as a money changer. You can take it as a transaction, a money changer in his shop. But you also have religious implications because her girdle, which stands for chastity, has been laid out on the table. And in the background, there are wafers, which refer to the Eucharist. And of course, we often see paintings from this era or from medieval art that have the scales representing judgment. Sometimes you even see a tiny little demon, weighing down one side of the scales. So it's a painting about daily life and real transactions, but it's also a painting that raises questions about marriage, sanctity, chastity, and all kinds of other things. It's hard to know if the central figure in red is a money changer or a saint or both. So capitalism led to prosperity and a demand for art objects. And a little bit later, I'm going to say in the 16th century, Amsterdam really became the first city in the world where you had what you and I would call commercial art galleries. Not all art was, being made for churches or being made for commissions. And you began to get things that are very familiar, landscapes and portraits. Patrons also wanted images of piety. So they had self-portraits, but they also had portraits of their favorite saints. They had devotional images that were custom made to demonstrate their wealth and lineage and piety. And class and character were major subjects for artists. So we think that this is a self-portrait by Jan van Eyck. We don't know for sure, but there is his name, of course, on the frame. And it's a very, very small painting. It is maybe the size, a little bit larger than a sheet of notebook paper. And you can see how it was made in black and white. It was made in grisaille. And then the red was all added to that turban in a single glaze. But it's so shrewd and so convincing. And look at the way that with his thin set lips, in this kind of unemotional way that Van Eyck or whoever he is seems to scrutinize you. that his eyes follow you out of the painting, and he looks across at you from 6.5 centuries ago and makes eye contact. Another Van der Weyden, portrait of a lady, and how about admiring the detail of that transparent veil? I think this is the new confidence that was coming to Northern painters, that they could do transparent imagery and wrap transparent fabric around the brow of this very, very pious woman. Look at her hands coming together as if in an image of prayer, the girdle representing her chastity with a very, very elaborate buckle. Fabulous, enchanting details that give you an intimate experience of these subjects. As we get to French and German art, French artists tended to serve nobility rather than the king. There continued to be an expansion or popularity of devotional artworks. And what we now call Germany is what then would have been called the Holy Roman Empire, often had what you'd call provincial art that was made not in great capital cities, but made by craftspeople at the edges. Here's an example of an early French work of art by Jean Fouquet. And these panels for many, many years were not together. They were rejoined, I think, during the 20th century by art historians who did a study, because in many ways they're so different from each other. But we believe it was originally a diptych. And on the left, we have this patron, the Etienne Chevalier, with St. Stephen. And St. Stephen is holding what's probably a Bible along with the stone that was used to stone him to death. That was his martyrhood. But he has been, we'll say, reconstituted for the purpose of the painting. And something just mind-bending about that particular panel is that Fouquet decided to show them in a hallway that was going, backwards to one side to the right. It didn't have a central vanishing point like the Dirk Bout's, Last Supper. So there's a new kind of perspective appearing in this fantastic kind of hallway. And then over on the right, we have a Mary. We have a Mary with her breast exposed and a Christ child. And it's been said that it seems likely that Fouquet worked from a sculpture, possibly an ivory sculpture, because if she seems so unreal and sanded and pale and perfect, that indicates that maybe it was made from a carving. And then the red and blue angels would have probably been made originally with the same grisaille technique and then glazed to give you the red, white, and blue that later became the French flag. A northern piece that has a new special effect. Conrad Witz tried to make the image of Christ walking on water and did it by using glaze to create reflection in the lake. So here you see we have one of the apostles swimming toward Christ who walks on water, and you can see the reflection of the fishermen in their boat. And art historians have gone back and found this exact location at Lake Geneva, where the painting was conceived. Another feature of this period was the continuation of fantastic lindenwood carvings, mainly in the Holy Roman Empire, in Germany and Poland. And this one by Wetzstoss has just layers and layers of gilded three-dimensional carvings. You might say that it was competing with painting in this era to tell the stories of holy events. And here's one by Tilman Reimenschneider that you can see in Germany that was not painted, made in lindenwood. And it's as if the carvers were trying to do in carving what the other, what the early artists had tried to do with illumination, to create fantastic abstract patterns that added to the glory, that played off the figures. One more thing to say about Northern art, and it's a significant thing to mention. I think we all know that printing and bookmaking, and of course we think later of the Gutenberg Bible, all these things developed in Germany. So printmaking was developing in Northern Europe. And of course, it started with woodcuts, which also were made in China, a form of relief printing on a flat block. Intaglio began to develop, And intaglio basically means scratched or etched, working with making a canyon on a plate. Papers began to develop, and cotton and linen papers came along that were mass produced to create printmaking as the first mass produced, mass available form of art. And then movable type began to appear in the middle of the 15th century. And when you get this movable type in these precious books, they're called incunabula. And just a little bit about this, but here are some tools for etching. I'm sure many of you have tried etching, maybe in your student days. And you know that dry point etching is when you simply scratch into a plate with a sharp point. But in Northern Europe, they were beginning to use acids, beginning to use zinc or copper plates. And by putting something like pitch tar on a plate, you could shield the plate from the acid. And where you removed that surface, you could get a line that then could be inked in. And that allowed the mass production of prints, as did woodblock carving. You actually can go on eBay today if you want after the class, and you can buy a page from the Nuremberg Chronicles, which was one of the first great mass-produced books. There were over 2,500 copies made in both Latin and in German, and it was a very, very thick book, many, many pages. And the idea that the creator, that Wohlgemuth had, was that he wanted to document history from the creation of the world. So it was part biblical and then part contemporary history. So there were 5 ages from creation to Christ, then a very, very large section on the present time, which of course was Europe in the 15th century. And then there's also a nice fiery apocalypse at the end. And I've been told that when you find these pages colored, they often were colored many, many years ago by print dealers who were trying to get more money for the individual pages. And there's an example of an engraving from the 15th century by Schongauer, St. Anthony tormented by demons. And you can see that one of the benefits of the attention to detail that took place in Northern art is you could detail the villains and the demons and the monsters as well as everything else. And what a vivid piece of art that somebody probably bought a print of at a cathedral when visiting as a pilgrim. I'll just mention that when I see you next time, when I see you on March 4th, when we hopefully again have good weather and the internet working, we'll talk about more Italian Renaissance. We'll cover 100 years of Italian art up to what you might call the High Renaissance.